Thank you all for being here. Talk about disruption. Weather's one of them, isn't it? To kind of lay the groundwork for what we're going to talk about, we've invited Phil LeBeau, who hardly needs an introduction, to talk to us about the CNBC Disruptor 50 list, which is produced every year. He'll talk about some companies that are on there, why they're picked as disruptors, and maybe touch on some of the automotive ones. Not very many of them, as it turns out. Phil LeBeau is a CNBC auto and airline industry reporter. He's based in Chicago. He also is editor of the Behind the Wheel section on CNBC.com. He's reported 1-hour documentaries for the network, including Dreamliner, Inside the World's Most Anticipated Airplane, Ford, Rebuilding an American Icon, and Saving General Motors, and Failure to Recall, Investigating GM, which won a 2014 Society of American Business Editors and Writers Award. Please join me in welcoming Phil LeBeau.
When Michelle said, let's hear what else is on the Disruptor 50 list, I thought, why don't I call it up real quick? So that's what I was doing. Thank you, Michelle. And yes, when I've done this in the past, as you guys know, I've generally taken the approach of, feel free to ask me questions. I'm going to talk for a little bit about the Disruptor 50 list, sort of how CNBC looks at disruptors, particularly when it comes to the automotive industry. Which I've covered since 1999, and over that time, as I've seen the industry evolve and I've seen the disruption of certain companies come and certain companies that were touted to be disruptors who turned out not to be, I've always thought it was pretty interesting. So let me start first off by explaining the CNBC Disruptor 50 list. How many are you familiar with it? Few of you, okay. So basically what it comes down to is this. There is a group of people at CNBC, I am not in that group, and there are submissions that are brought to them in terms of, hey, if you looked at this company, all of the companies that are considered, they cannot be public, but there is a certain level of traction and they have certain metrics set up in terms of financially how much money they're bringing in. In other words, it can't be somebody in their college dorm room who says, I've got this great idea, I'm going to disrupt this industry, whatever that industry might be. It might be an interesting idea, but it doesn't mean that it's going to make the Disruptor 50 list. So just let me give you a sense of the top 10 from last year's list. And by the way, the current year's list will come out in late February, early March. So they're in the process right now of looking at this year's, what they call the Disruptor 50. Number 1, Moderna Therapeutics. 2 is SpaceX. 3, Bloom Energy, live off the grid, keep the lights on. No surprise at number 4, Uber. Airbnb is number 5. Dropbox is 6. Palantir Tech is 7. TransferWise, I don't know if you're familiar with them or not, getting bankers out of the foreign exchange business was 8. Slack was 9. Warby Parker was 10. I won't go down the whole list of all 50, but that's just a taste of some of the companies that were on the Disruptor 50 list last year. And over the last 3 years that we've done it at CNBC, few of the companies have eventually gone public. Some of the companies, if you go back and look at previous lists, you go, whatever happened to these guys? Never heard of them before. And never heard of them since. And which sort of speaks to the whole question of why is one company disruptive, and are we touting them as disruptive when in fact it's interesting. In theory, they might be disruptive, but over time it plays out that they really weren't. Just so to put in some perspective, for the automotive industry, Uber was the only auto-related company considered a Disruptor 50 last year. In 2014, Uber was on the list, as was Eco Motors. And then in 2013, Uber once again. So they've been on all 3 years, as well as GetAround, if you're familiar with them, and Waze, the traffic and navigation startup. So those were the companies, the only ones in the auto industry that made the Disruptor 50 list, which is interesting. Now you might sit there and say, well, look, there's a lot of tech companies that are on there, a lot of different industries, a lot of pharmaceutical companies that are on there because they're changing different things in terms of how the pharmaceutical industry is conducting business. But it brings up the question. Lyft wasn't on their list. Lyft wasn't mentioned. Tesla couldn't be because it was a publicly traded company. Google, publicly traded, couldn't be on there, nor could Apple. But I think if you would ask anybody, and I hear this on a regular basis, why are those guys so disruptive to the auto industry? I think it's the number one question that I receive from everybody. In their minds, Tesla, Google, Apple, they are the disruptors of the automotive industry. They do not look at the traditional automakers as disruptive. In fact, late last year, Boston Consulting Group came out with a list of the 50 most innovative companies. So I went and I looked at this. And I went down the list and I said, well, which ones have some kind of an auto connection? Apple was 1, Google 2, Tesla 3, Toyota 6, BMW 7, Daimler 10, Tata 26, Renault 33, VW 35. No mention of GM, no mention of Ford, no mention of Chrysler, no mention of any company based here in southeastern Michigan. So it brings up the question, are the traditional automakers here truly disruptive? I think they are. Having done enough stories with General Motors, with Ford, whether it's the announcement that was made last week about GM taking a stake in Lyft, which I think has the potential to be a disruptive move, or pilot programs for autonomous drive vehicles. I do think that some of the moves that are being tried out by the traditional automakers have the potential to be disruptive. I also think that there is a little more flag waving and cheerleading in the auto industry here in the U.S. that they are disrupting themselves than in reality is taking place. Some of the moves could pan out, some of them may not pan out. But there is the willingness by many executives to cloak themselves in the idea of, hey, I'm changing my business. Well, you may be changing your business. Are you disrupting your business? Probably not. What about Delphi? Last week we were at CES and we had a chance to check out the new vehicle-to-everything technology, which in theory could be huge. Vehicle-to-vehicle communication, vehicle-to-infrastructure, vehicle-to-pedestrian. The potential there is enormous. I look at that and I say, well, here's some disruptive technology. There's no doubt that Delphi is one supplier, not the only supplier, but one supplier that is doing some disruptive work. What about the rental car industry? You're going to hear from Brian Johnson, I know, in a little bit. And he was the one who, not long ago, turned me on to Silvercar. He said, are you familiar with Silvercar? How many of you know what Silvercar is? So you guys know who they are. And if you've ever gone to a city and tried Silvercar, you can see why they could be disruptive to the rental car industry. It's a pretty innovative and interesting service. And then there are lots of other smaller companies that aren't getting a whole lot of attention. BP, if you're familiar with them, out in California, Carvana. They're trying to change the way people are buying and selling used cars. So I do see the disruption happening in the automotive industry, and I think that there's a lot of it happening here in southeastern Michigan. Perhaps we're not giving it as much attention as it should get, but it's taking place. And it's just a question of whether or not people give it the attention that it deserves. So with that, as I said when Michelle said, hey, could you speak? I said I'd be happy to. I'd love to take questions from anybody. I know there is a microphone. There's also cards. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them up here, ask them, and I'll be happy to take your questions. This is how we did it when we did the speech, I want to say like 3 years ago. In general, most people had questions at that time as far as the health of the auto industry as it was coming back. I think what's interesting when you look at where the disruptors are, and yes, they're based out in California, but having spent a lot of time out there and increasingly spending more time out there, I can sense that they are gearing their energies more towards the automotive industry. And that is, I think, a good sign, encouraging sign. So, do you have any questions? There's got to be somebody who has a question. Yes.
Okay, I'll start.
Thank you, Michelle.
You know, as we were putting this together, we have a lot of questions about what is truly a disruptor and what is an innovator. There's even that discussion
There's even that discussion of whether Tesla is really a disruptor or an innovator. When your people pick the Disruptor 50, do they have that discussion?
Yes.
Okay.
I asked some of the folks on the panel. Their opinion is a disruptor is changing truly the fundamentals of how business is done. And in their opinion, SpaceX is a good example that they are fundamentally changing how business is done when it comes to space exploration, the launching of satellites, the cost equations that go in there. Now you can make the argument, well, the federal government really was the disruptor there by saying, we're not going to do it anymore through NASA. It's going to have to be private business. So there is a bit of a chicken and egg discussion. But the fundamental idea is that it has to change how business is being done in order for them to consider it to be a truly disruptive company. And again, you look at the list. Some of the companies that are on the list, you'll come away and you'll be like, okay, I'm not really sure they're that disruptive. And they may not be. I mean, I went back and I looked at some of the previous lists, and some of these companies, they're not there. So it's a fair question, and it's sort of that chicken and egg, which is coming first, the innovation or is the disruption really what's driving it? Oops, somebody else? Wait.
Hi, Phil. It's Rich Hilgert from Morningstar.
Hey, Rich.
How you doing?
Good.
Good. Given your background in investments, CNBC being an investor channel, and my background in investments, you had talked about innovation as being something that you see in the automotive industry, and that there are disruptors in the automotive industry in the traditional auto sector. But would you agree that there are many stock valuations out there today that really don't reflect the change and the potential in this industry?
Yes.
And if so, what does the industry need to do to get the commensurate valuation that it really deserves?
I'm not sure what the industry does need to do, and I know that's not really a good answer, but I do think that the industry does not get the credit for the innovation and the disruption that is taking place here. And I think part of that is driven by this belief amongst investors and on Wall Street to a certain extent, well, if you're an automotive company, this is your valuation, and you're going to trade at this multiple, and that's what it's going to be. And I've had conversations with analysts and people on Wall Street where they clearly change their wording in terms of how they view different companies, even though they're all in the same industry. Why is Tesla at the valuation it's at when General Motors is not? Now, you can make an argument, look, it doesn't have a lot of the same legacy costs that are involved, the same amount of capital expenditures that are involved as General Motors. Therefore, it doesn't have, certain baggage, if you will, that investors have to worry about. My argument on the flip side is, okay, but just because of that, then you give a multiple to one company here and a multiple here. I think that's something that Wall Street struggles with. I think you would agree with that. And I'm not sure what it's going to take to change that. It's similar to getting away from investors. If I can tell you the number of times that I will do a story on one of the big three, and if they do anything with the Silicon Valley or that is tech-oriented, I will get bombarded with emails from people saying, yeah, but they're still a member of the big three. They're Luddites, and they don't know what they're doing. It doesn't matter how many times you do the story. You can talk about how forward-thinking Mark Fields or Mary Barra or some of the executives are, or some of the moves that they've made. There is a certain amount of, I don't want to say institutional, but it's out there, cultural sense that the auto industry in southeastern Michigan is not advancing.